Hi everyone. We recently provided updated schedules for information and security and data protection. We'd reviewed them based on some initial questions when we published the framework in June, particularly around subcontractors and how the different security levels applied to those. We have simplified them slightly, but they are still demanding to a certain extent. And the reason for that is obviously that we are looking after service user data here. By definition, any data you hold about service users will highlight the fact that they are convicted offenders, because otherwise we wouldn't be referring them. So it is necessary for us to have a reasonable level of security. However, we're really keen that that's not an obstacle to bidding. We don't want you to be thinking, do you know what, I know that I'm really, really good at rehabilitation and resettlement services, but I'm so unsure about the information security requirements that I'm not going to bid. We don't want that to be the case. So we want to, first of all, try and explain the requirements to you, but then more importantly, to hear back from you around what are the bits that you're still most concerned about, and are there specific actions we can take to help you get to that standard, to help you understand it more and reach that standard. And we're really keen to help you get to that standard so that you're able to bid and provide the services that you're best at. So I think that's the main thing I want to get across, either today or following the session. We just want to know how best to help you.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll look at the information security and data protection requirements. And this is the agenda for this session. We're going to look at the general context, at information security, the certifications that you will need to achieve, the data protection elements, what's involved in mobilization and transition, and then the questions. That's what we've got in store for you. Here we go. So the key points, I think, here is this one. It's the point that Janet made. This is an issue where we need to keep the information secure. Often I wonder, when I'm wandering around websites, why they need to have such complicated passwords and things. Here, we're talking about service users who, as Janet said, are by definition convicted offenders, and we need to keep that information secure. So that's the general framework in which this whole session and the whole contract is about. We need proper IT security, cyber security to make this work. Okay, so the context is that the Ministry of Justice will provide the system. It will provide a comprehensive system that of all the case information. That will be based on the internet, and they will provide full support of that. So that is all dealt with, that is all there. What you will need is to have the necessary IT in place to support it. So obviously the hardware to support it, you'll need, but you'll also need strong cybersecurity practices. This is especially the case for anything you're doing outside the system, but it's generally the case. You'll need secure email. You'll need all of these in place to, sorry, excuse me, to make sure that, well, it's a requirement of the contract that you will have to have all those in place. I'll be talking in a little bit about what we mean by cybersecurity, about what elements this covers, so you can get a more detailed look at that. So, looking at schedules 2.3 and 2.4, yeah, so strong cybersecurity practices. The government classification scheme at official is actually the lowest level. It means we're not secret and we're not top secret, but it is a level that needs a high level of security. Okay. Schedule 2.4. So what the day one contracts on this level, so there's S1, there's S2, there's S3, and there's S4. You only get access to the MOJ systems on S3 and S4, and most of the day one contracts will be at S4. The ones later on, we don't know. There may be some of the smaller ones at S3. Now, the question is the volume of data, the number of service users. This isn't just for this contract, but it's aggregated. It's the total volume across all the contracts that you have with HMPPS. If you're a subcontractor, it only involves your own records. It doesn't involve the entire contract, the entire prime contract. But you need to work out, so if your level is above 2,500, then you're at security level S4. So let's look at what those involve. S3, I'm going to skip back to those moments. So S3 requires that you have an information security management plan in operation. The authority, as it says here, can provide that template. So you don't, so they can provide all of that. You need to have encrypted email, and you need to have all of your staff signed up to baseline security standard. That means that they will need to fill out the necessary form. They'll need to send off their passport and NI. You know, some of you will have already been through this kind of thing, but they also will need to have annual training, because there's two elements to this whole thing. One is the IT elements, keeping your IT secure. The other element is making sure that your people understand GDPR, data protection legislation, and are keeping the information secure. So there's both of those are needed, and that's just for S3. For S4, there's a higher level that you'll need, which is these kinds of elements, the proactive defense. You need to be continuously testing your systems. You need to be ready to review things. You need to have daily backup and a quarterly test of that backup, and you need to keep comprehensive audit records. So that's what's involved in S4. Now, let me try and these are the ones back here, which I skipped through. You will need to look through all of these. There's some nice simple ones like the NCSC Small Charity Guide, and crucial elements then, Cyber Essentials Plus. This is a certification, and you'll need to achieve that 2 weeks before the service commencement. Okay? If you've already got ISO or ASME, you don't need Cyber Essentials Plus. I'll be talking a bit later about what's involved in Cyber Essentials Plus, but that is a certification you will need by 2 weeks before service commencement, so in June 2021. You will need ISO 27001 or IASME by 6 months after the service commencement. That is an absolute requirement. And again, later on, we'll be talking about what's involved in those. So what does this all mean? What does this all mean? This is a really useful guide that is in the, I'll just send you a link to that. It's in the materials, but I really like this one. So I'm going to share it in the chat, where the link to this one is. There's the link to that one. Okay, and this is out to the core to cybersecurity. Backup, malware, making sure your smartphones are safe, avoiding phishing attacks, and having effective passwords. Let's just go through those in detail. So, number one, backing up your data. As we go through this, have a think about whether you're doing these things at the moment. You obviously will need to be doing those once you get a contract. Is your backup regular? Is it daily? Do you test it? Is it separate, i.e. do you not have it connected to your system? So say you were backing up on tape, you need to make sure that those tapes are outside the building, but ideally you're backing up to the cloud. Ideally, and nowadays, you're backing up to the cloud so that you can, so that it's out there and very much separate from your actual systems. Because what can happen is malware. We ourselves at Happy had a malware attack 2 years ago. We had a ransomware attack where every file on our system got encrypted, and on the basis that we could only decrypt it by paying a ransom, which obviously we didn't do. And it's not just us that have been affected by this. I know many other companies, including people in the NHS, who have. If you have a comprehensive backup, that's not a problem, because you can just get the backup loaded straight up. If you haven't got a comprehensive backup, you are fairly stuffed if you have that kind of attack. So why did we have that? We had that because one or two of our computers did not have their antivirus software up to date. Right? So say you've got 20 computers, 20 laptops, and one or two of them haven't updated their antivirus software, you're vulnerable. So make sure you have the antivirus software. Make sure it's completely up to date with the latest patches, and you will need a firewall. What a firewall is something that prevents, it's on your network and prevents things you don't want getting into your system. Okay. So third, smartphones and tablets. They also need to have the malware prevention, and they also, you need to make sure that they're password protected. Some people have phones which, you switch on and they haven't got passwords or anything. And ideally that you can track them and actually delete stuff off them if you know that they've been lost or stolen. Fourthly, password security. All your devices obviously need encrypted, and you need strong passwords on those. And so you need to make sure that whoever is getting into the system is viable to get into that system. And phishing attacks. This is probably one of the greatest vulnerabilities. Where you get a phishing attack where it says, this is your bank, can you click on this link to update something? Or we get them a lot at Happy, which simply says, this is you need to update your Microsoft password. Or another one we're getting more regularly now is people are getting messages from me saying you need to do this. So one aspect of that is antivirus software, but also it's about building staff awareness. Staff need to know what they shouldn't click on in email. So those are 5 key elements. There'll be more needed, but I think those are 5 very practical elements. So I'm going to move on now to the next steps. So these are the certifications that you'll need to have in place. From day one, even actually from 2 weeks before, you will need Cyber Essentials Plus. Okay. From 6 months after, you'll need ISO 27001 or IASME. So what do these involve? Cyber Essentials Plus, as I say, not Cyber Essentials Basics, but Cyber Essentials Plus. There are 5 basic security controls, and you need to undergo a technical audit. All of these have costs involved, but those costs can be included in the bid that you put to the authority. Okay, so when you put in your bid, so make sure you find out how much it costs to have the audit for Cyber Essentials Plus and how much it costs for the other ones. The 5 essentials are very similar to the the security items I just talked about. You need to have a firewall. You need to have clear password protection on your users, a secure configuration. You need to have that malware protection I talked about. You need to make sure everything is being kept up to date with the latest patches. That's the core things you need for Cyber Essentials Plus, and you will have up to June to achieve that, but many of you have got it. Some of you have got the basics and need to up to that. Okay, ISO 27001 is the international standard for information security management, and you need either that or is made by 6 months after commencement. And they will cover the whole range: financial information, intellectual property, employee details, all of these key elements. And you'll need this requires an audit that costs somewhere between 2 and 7 grand, depending on the size of your organization. Alternatively, you can go for IASME. IASME was developed by the government because they wanted one that was more appropriate to small businesses. So the aim is that it's more achievable and more affordable. And it covers all of these elements. The key elements that you need in place to have proper security: so backup, the response, the change management, the risk assessment, these kind of elements. Okay, so that is what you'll need in place. Okay, again, any thoughts, put into the chat. Any questions, put into the chat. Any reflections you have already on what's involved. Caroline asked a question that we've been advised that Cyber Essentials is sufficient depending on value of the contract. For day one, and for access to the MOJ system, then you will need, that's right, isn't it, Janet? after 6 months to have ISO or IASME.
Yeah,
All right, Janet?
Yeah, so you'll need Cyber Essentials Plus in order to commence the services, in order to get access to our systems and our data. And in addition, within 6 months of commencing, you need either ISO or IASME.
Okay.
Just to maybe add, the distinction between Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus is that Cyber Essentials Plus, you go through the same process, but it's independently audited rather than self-certified. So that's what the plus means, is that you have someone who's independent who will ensure that you have met the requirements of Cyber Essentials. And that's when you get the Cyber Essentials Plus certification.
Okay, so there's some good questions coming in the chat. We'll be answering those after the end of this this talk. So let's just go through the other ones. I will share the screen again. Okay. So you'll also need in place a data protection roadmap within a month of the contract. So you need to be explaining how you will share data and who with. So you'll probably need, there'll be people you need to share it with: education authorities, housing, possibly other places. So who will you be sharing the data of your service users? And the authority can provide guidance on that. That's within 1 month of the contract. You'll need that. And obviously you need to comply with the HMPPS information sharing policy on that, and whatever, and you need your data protection registration to include that legal right to share. So you need to make sure that the data sharing fits those legal requirements. And you need to keep a data log of it all. So if you are sharing with other people, if you are sharing with the education or with anybody outside the authority system, you need to keep a log of how you're sharing it, who you're sharing it with, all these kinds of elements. That all needs to be in place, because obviously we need to keep secure all the information for our users. Okay. Also, you need to have full data protection in place, and the UK only point is that you need to be keeping your data in the UK, right? Now this is quite a key point, because depending on what software you're using, you could well be stored in the US or in other places. So unless you get written consent from the originating controller, you need to be storing in the UK. And obviously the actual stuff on the case system will be stored in the UK. You don't need to worry about that. It's any data you're sharing elsewhere, which could be anywhere on the cloud. It could be your SharePoint, it could be whatever you're using. And you also need to prepare to indemnify for any potential breach of user data. Okay, so implementation and transition. At implementation, you'll need all critical IT and Cyber Essentials Plus in place at the date of commencement, and in fact 2 weeks before. So that's likely to be June 2021. Next, you'll need ISO and IASME in place by 6 months afterwards. I think that, yeah, those are the key elements that need to be there. Actually, that's all. I've skimmed through that quite quickly. You'll have access to this slide. You'll also have access to a more comprehensive slide deck that HMPPS has put together that has much more detail in it. Also, you will find all of the documents when you go to the procurement in Jagger. You'll find all the documents there. Okay, again, type any questions in there. We'll be doing the stuff on what support and guidance you needed after the questions, but type any further questions in. So first of all, from before, one from Andy: are these standards applicable to all subcontractors as well as primes? Janet, my understanding is yes, if they're entering into the day one contracts. Is that right?
Yes, it's, well, not just the day one contract. In general, they are applicable to both, but the level that you're at will depend on your amount of data. So if you have a supplier which has 2,500 records, but you're a subcontractor and you only have 500 records, then it's your 500 records which count rather than the supplier's amount of records.
And the ones with 500, will they still need to achieve ISO or IASME?
So for the day one contracts, we expect everyone to have access to MOJ systems. Our expectation is that subcontractors will also need access to those systems, because the point of those systems is to record data about the interventions you're giving to service users, and it would be difficult to do that if you didn't have access to our systems. Now, that's our expectation. If you think you are going to have a subcontracting arrangement where for some reason you don't directly enter the data on the system and you give that back to the supplier to enter for you, then potentially you wouldn't need access and therefore ISO and IASME. But I think it would be useful to speak to us about that if that's your expectation, because there is a requirement in the contract that you update the system immediately so that we know at all times what has happened with the service user, because the MPS needs to have sight of that information in relatively real time.
Okay.
Just to add on the question about acting as a subcontractor, part of the reason why we have separated out subcontractors who may be processing less information is on the basis that that subcontractor would be operating using their own IT. Clearly, if the prime or the main supplier is providing the IT equipment, systems, services to its supply chain to operate as well, then actually you'd be looking at the prime's security level category, because actually the subcontractor would be processing that data within the same systems, the same environment as the main contractor. Where the subcontractor is processing a smaller number of cases, that is on the assumption that they're doing that using their own IT systems.
Okay, there's a question. Yeah. Okay, there's a question from Emily. The number of data subjects, is it across the project year or the whole organisation? It's the whole organisation, isn't it? It's not just this project. Is that right, James?
No, it's in relation to the contracts that they're delivering and the number of cases that they are working on through the contract term.
Within the dynamic framework. So for instance, if you've got a prison education framework contract, that doesn't count as part of this aggregation. Okay.
And there's some questions on the cost of IASME. I don't know if we know that. Do we know that, James? The cost of doing IASME?
So we can provide maybe some indicative costs of the certification itself, but actually the cost to your organisation will be very much dependent on things like the size of your organisation and the scope of the work that's required. So it's very difficult to give you a price that will be useful, because actually it will be very much tailored to the type and size of organisation seeking that certification.
Okay, and Stephen asked if that cost can be covered in the contract cost. It can, can't it, Janet?
So yes, I mean, essentially everything which it costs you to deliver the service needs to be included within your contract price, yes.
Okay, actually let's ask some people to ask their questions. Peter, you don't have an office or network. Tell us about your situation.
Well, everybody works from home, basically. Always have done. We do have a desk in a probation office, but that's the extent of it. We share information via Dropbox, and everybody has a laptop.
Okay, so James, I presume they still need to fit the standards.
Yeah, so it will be looking at what's in front of you, presumably, and understanding for the laptop that you have that all of that equipment meets the required standard. So although you may not have a large infrastructure, your organisation is may consist of just one person with one device. That does need to be assured that it meets the standards, because particularly if you're using it to hold sensitive data or being used to access our systems, it needs to meet our requirements to protect not only the data that you may be accessing, but also the integrity of the wider system. That's why these standards have been set.
So James, presumably Peter's organisation would need a firewall on each device, is that right?
So I wouldn't wish to kind of say specifically what it is that you'll need that you don't have already, for example, but you will need to ensure that if you're accessing our systems, that you have Cyber Essentials Plus.
And you probably also need to check where the Dropbox information was being held as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of the data. It's not just your laptop.
Yeah, I think okay. So what size? So Simon, what your question is about the size of organisation? Simon, where are you?
I'm here. It's just the the turnover to access IASME.
I think that's any size can't they, James?
Yeah, I think if you contact contact the organisation or someone who's providing services on behalf of IASME, I don't believe that there is any minimum threshold, but that's something to pick up with them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's what the SME stands for. It stands for small and medium organisations. So
Right. Should have asked what the acronym was.
No, that's all right. It's information for small to medium enterprises.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you.
Andy, ask your question. Unmute.
Sorry, which one was it? I fired a few.
The small, how have you? The small, if you're a small organisation and don't have access to the MOJ framework.
Yeah, if the data subject is very low and you're more in a category of an S1 or an S2, how do we get connected in the way that the presentation very much highlighted the level of requirements for an S4? So is it any different for an S1 or an S2?
Well, it would be, and it would be predicated on the basis that you would have no access to the systems holding this case information. So if that was the case, and you were working presumably with a large organisation that's working as the supplier, then you may well fall within that S1 or S2 category. However, if delivering the services would require you to have access to that data, then you would be looking to move up to probably S3.
And just to clarify, the reason we've focused the presentation on S3 and S4 is because we do expect all of the day one contracts to require access to the system. It is possible that there are other contracts in other categories in the future which won't require access to the system. So for instance, service user involvement, where you're running, for instance, focus groups for service users, you wouldn't need to report on the system in the same way, because that's not information, that's case level information that the MPS needs to have sight of. On the contrary, you wouldn't want them to have sight of who's been in what focus group, etc. So that's why we have those S1 and S2. But for these kind of core services where the MPS needs to know what you're doing with each service user, then we expect system access.
Okay, Gemma, you've got...
The only other thing I would potentially add is, if you were working for a large organisation that was acting as the prime, that was itself at S3 and S4, so that it had all of its IT at that standard, and that organisation supplied you with that equipment, so long as you were within the scope of its accreditation and you were able to use that equipment. Clearly, that would also enable you to operate and deliver the services because you would be coming under the certification accreditation of the Prime.
Okay, move on to Gemma. Your question on Cyber Essentials Plus.
Hi, yeah, I just I was under the impression that Cyber Essentials Plus was only necessary for contracts over $1 million, and if you were bidding for contracts under that value, that the basic Cyber Essentials was sufficient. And also, I've got a question around if you are holding that as a qualification, why is there a need 6 months later to then, you know, gain additional qualifications?
So taking the point around the sort of threshold requirement for Cyber Essentials Plus, we do require that for anyone who's accessing our systems and our data through it. And that's also been looked at, not just at the type of data, but also we tried to look at the volume of data. And we felt that it was a better way to determine that looking at the caseload than at the contract values. And in relation to your second question, we have the two separate requirements because Cyber Essentials Plus is specifically in relation to electronic data, whereas IASME and ISO 27001 are broader in their scope and ensure that you have the appropriate controls in place to manage information that may be held on paper, for example, that it covers things like physical security, so actually where that information is held, the buildings, and personal security. So it relates also to actually the individuals who are using that data and processing that data. So Cyber Essentials is specifically around electronic data. The IASME, ISO, and PAS standards cover that broader information assurance requirement. That's why there are two separate things.
So are they changes then to what the original, when the original framework came out? Are they new additions?
So they're not new additions. We refer to these in the market engagement events, 12 or so months ago. What we have been doing is trying to recognise that there may be organisations, particularly in the supply chain, that would not be either accessing our systems in the future framework commissioning or would be processing a much smaller amount of data, and we wanted to reflect that in the requirements.
Okay. Sarah, you've got a question on primes and subcontractors. Are you there, Sarah?
Hi, yeah. We're just discussing in the breakout room regarding sort of if subcontractors are not certified, but the costs can be included in the bid, but the primes actually don't want to reflect that in their bid to be able to win the contract, then that is going to rule out some subcontractors from receiving any work. Any
thoughts on that, Janet?
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to know how often that's the case. I mean, I think in general, if a prime wants you to be a subcontractor, it's because you add something to their bid, which,
it's just a hypothetical, not an actual sort of reflection of any sort of discussions, but I'm just thinking that potentially could rule out particularly quite small organisations from winning any sort of work as a subcontractor.
So I would hope that in those situations, primes would be willing to support you with that cost. So there's different ways they could do it. They could include you within their ISO or IASME accreditation, but you know, they would need to commit to doing that. The Cyber Essentials Plus is not such an expense that it should be problematic, I don't think. So yes, I mean, and I think it would be in their interests to make that investment in your information security to get your skills that you add to their bid.
Okay,
Thank
Michelle. Sorry, Sarah, carry on.
No, it's Janet. Just to add to that, I think if you find that is a problem, we would certainly be keen to hear about that. So yeah, do please let us know if that in practice does become a problem. Okay,
and Michelle, what, you've got a question about Endelius.
Yeah, we currently use the Endelius software for NPS and the likes. Is that going to be the same software that you're talking about, or is it something different?
No, the Ministry of Justice digital team is developing some specific new services that will be available to providers over the internet from your own IT infrastructure, so long as you meet the type of requirements that we've set out. The data will be very much linked into the National DLIS database that you're familiar with, but you will not be expected to have access to the full National DLIS that you may be used to currently.
So does that mean that we wouldn't then use Endelius, we would only use the new software?
Correct.
Ah, that's good.
Okay.
And there are two, I mean, maybe an opportunity just to sort of set this out. So there are two elements to this. So the first is essentially a referral form that you will receive with the information about the service user that you'll be providing an intervention to, and that will contain all the relevant information that we expect you will require. And you will then have a facility to submit information back. So the system, and indeed the National DLIS database, as it were, will remain up to date. The second type of service that we have in development, which we expect to be in place for the start of the day one contracts, is a tool that will enable you to provide information, in effect, to the NPS about the interventions that are being provided, so that the NPS has an up-to-date understanding of the interventions that are available. So those are the two sort of type of electronic services that providers will be using.
Okay, I think that's clear. Stephanie, you've been doing a bit of Googling on the IASME, haven't you? Tell us your question.
Yes, well, as with the Cyber Essentials, it is that there's two levels. One's self-certification and the Cyber Plus is the one that's audited, and it appears that the IASME is the same. So there has been, it's not something I'm familiar with, isn't the IASME?
So it would be the audited,
so
be the audited version at that upper level. So for where you're looking for IASME, it would be an audited.
It would be audited.
It wouldn't be self-certified.
Right. Okay. Because that hasn't been made clear previously.
So I think IASME is only audited.
Yeah.
There's two levels on the website that I got.
I wonder whether
in the last 5 minutes that I've looked.
It is possible. It is possible that you're looking at the information regarding actually their Cyber Essentials services. So as well as providing the IASME certification, I think they also provide support for Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus.
Well, the website that I've got, it says IASME.
That it's referring to that, but obviously I can't see.
Well,
Stephanie, the answer is yes. It needs to. You need the audited version. Yeah.
Marvelous. So in that regard, there was a reference previously made that you would make an estimate of cost. Do we know what that may be?
Janet, do you have any indicative numbers that we have for IASME?
I do, not to hand, but essentially, as James said earlier, that it will depend on the size of your organisation. I have got some minimum figures somewhere. They're actually not terribly different to the ISO figures, which again, for ISO, it depends on the size of your organisation. There are different bandings. I mean, I can share what I've got from IASME in the past, but primarily you would need to get an individual quote.
So we're still talking between sort of 2 and 7 grand
Yeah.
now.
I think it goes less high than that. It's perhaps 2 to 5 from recollection, but you would need to get an individual quote.
And this, Peter, let's come back to your question on storing within the UK. That is, so how can we use the cloud? That is something whenever you use anything like Peter's Dropbox, you need to check where it is, don't you, James?
Yes, yeah. So that's one of the things that you'll need to assess is actually not just your devices, but actually where the data is held. And you should be able to get support on that. It should be quite an understandable query for you to be able to submit in terms of where that data is held. And for service user data, for HMPPS data, the requirement is that it's stored in the UK.
Okay.
Come back to the cost point, which is just to confirm, obviously, that this will be a mobilisation cost. So we would expect this to be covered within the mobilisation costs, which are on top of the previous contract values that we released. The mobilisation costs for the education contracts were released as part of the launch last week, and there it's around 640,000 total for mobilisation. So that should be sufficient to cover the accreditation type costs.
Okay, one final question from Elaine, which relates back to previous prime and subcontract one. Elaine, do you want to ask your one?
Yeah, so I guess, well, I've got 2 questions really. One is, how are data sets being calculated? Is it per year or over the lifetime of the contract?
Sorry, the cost?
The data sets. So you're saying you expect most people to be falling into S3 or 4. How are you calculating data sets? Is it per year or per contract?
Per contract.
Per contract.
So over 3 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're looking at being applied for a very small county. It's being commissioned at PCC level, so it's one of the multi-category lots. So even if you add all 4 organisations together over a period of 3 years, we're still not getting to S3 or 4.
But you'll have access to MOJ systems, so that's what makes you in S3 or S4. If it's less than 2,500 over the, is it a women's contract or wellbeing?
It's wellbeing.
Okay, so yeah, you may be at less than 2,500 over the.
How aren't they?
Sorry.
Yeah,
you may be less than 2,500, but you'll still be S3 because you'll have access to MOJ systems.
Okay, because that wasn't clear in the framework. Okay, so then if all 4 organisations, which are in our supply chain, need to qualify and get all this accreditation, and you're saying this is maybe like 5,000, that's 20K, does that start making us uncompetitive?
So I suppose you would need to look at whether it was possible to do that for the contract service operation, and so it might be worth you getting in touch with IASME or ISO as to whether you could get accreditation for the service, including your 4 organisations. I don't know if that's the case, but it would be worth checking that point with them as to whether you do need 4 separate accreditations or you could do it by service.
Right.
And you know, the other thing I would just ask is whether or not all of those organisations need to operate off their own IT in order to be able to deliver the service, or could you have one set of IT services that are used by your operation in the delivery of it. Because clearly, if you were having, if each of those organizations in the supply chain were independently going through all of this, that may come out as a different cost to where actually you have a single set of IT which meets the requirements that all parts of the operation needing access would use.
Okay, I think the challenge for us, because we're 4 very, very small organizations, I'm talking less than 10 people in each. If nobody has an IT expert, and this is really challenging stuff for us. So how do you even, we've even tried to get some sort of free IT help around this, but none of us really know where to start, I guess. It's knowing even, I don't know how you go about sharing 4 organizations with different IT, different buildings, sharing a system. I don't even know how you start.
Okay, Elaine, I'm going to go on to what support and guidance you need. What you do is this on a different piece of technology. I'd like you to pick up your phones, type Slido into the browser, and then type the code that's in chat, which is 32649, into that. And there you'll get a chance to put in the support that you would like to request, that you think that you need, support, guidance, whatever. Put just one line in. You can put a second question as well if you like. Okay. Okay, James and Janet, so the top one is a list of questions we need to ask our IT, which has got two actually prompts. Is that possible?
So
I think we can take this away. I don't think we can kind of make commitments about what we will definitely do to answer these right now, but what we will do is take them away and work with Clinks after the event in terms of how best we meet the demands.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Okay, that's grand. So
but it is really helpful to get your views in terms of what it is that you feel would be really helpful.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Feel free to put more in, but that's very clear. Donna, you've got one last question from Donna.
Yes, I guess I'm thinking more along getting data from the system for reporting. I don't see that probably being a possibility, which will mean that we will then have to duplicate some of the recording onto a separate system that we use internal to the organisation, which means that we will hold obviously some of that data regarding those people, those clients who we're supporting. So does that have implications for subcontractors for cybersecurity?
So thank you, Donna. I think firstly, we will be expecting you to be provided with some reporting capability.
Okay, that's helpful.
Obviously for the services you're providing on your own data, as it were, your own cases, where obviously you're taking that data that may contain personal information, particularly, that's where clearly that would need to be considered within the scope of your own security for yours or subcontractors' IT systems. And whilst the core systems or core services will be provided through the digital services we offer, that's not to prevent actually organisations who are actually seeking to hold data on their own infrastructure to be able to do so, but it will mean that there may be some additional security, obviously, around how that information is managed.
Brilliant, thank you for that. That helps a lot, and I'm pleased to hear that there will be data reporting facility. That can be a bit of a faff, so that's good as well. Brilliant.
And what the team responsible for these digital services will be looking for is some engagement with you. So you represent, the users of the digital services we provide. Mm-hmm. In order for them to work as well as possible, we will need your input. So we will be looking for, during the course of this framework, to be working with users of our services to constantly be improving them. So where, for example, there might be, and I think reporting is a really good example, there might be types of report or information that you'd be looking at to be able to better understand how the impact of the delivery of your services, how you're managing it. I can see that would be potentially quite a fruitful area of engagement with our teams.
Yes, that's really reassuring to hear. Thank you.
Oh, one last question from Caroline. Can we pull data from MPS system? Caroline?
So, Caroline, it would be good to understand perhaps a little bit more specifically what you're seeking to do. As I was saying to Donna a minute ago, we will be providing certainly reporting capability where you're looking to actually draw data directly, potentially using something like an API. Then we would want to discuss that with you and understand actually what's the information that you'd be seeking to take from our system.
It was just the reporting.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But on that note, and I will say it's close to 11. So bye bye from all of us. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.